The candles are lit 200 at a time. Watch the wax drip onto silver plate. Watch the light catch on cloth of gold sleeves. Watch 100 pairs of eyes turn toward the great doors as trumpets sound and the first course is carried in. A roasted peacock, its feathers sewn back onto the cooked bird so that it appears, for one impossible moment, to be alive again. This is a Tudor banqueting hall in full cry. Somewhere beneath the minstrel's gallery, a viol player counts the beat. Somewhere near the high table, a nobleman who owes more money than he will ever repay is laughing at a joke he did not find funny, because the man who told it controls whether his daughter marries well. And in the centre of the floor, skirts sweep the rush-strewn stone in a pavan so precise it looks like geometry falling in love with itself. This is not relaxation, this is theatre, and everyone in the room knows they are both audience and performer. We think we know Tudor England. We have seen the crowns, the executions, the 6 wives, the wars of religion, painted in blood-red strokes across 100 television dramas. But strip away the politics for a moment, just a moment, and ask a stranger question. When the most powerful and the most desperately wealthy people in 16th century England wanted to enjoy themselves, what did they actually do? Not what the moralists claimed they did, not what the propaganda insisted a godly Christian court should look like. What did they do in the hours between crises, when the wine had been poured and the candles were burning down and nobody outside the walls could see? The answer is stranger, crueler, funnier, and more human than most people expect. It involves bears chained to stakes and torn apart for sport, while ladies in jewelled hoods cheer from balconies. It involves gambling debts so catastrophic they toppled ancient families in a single night. It involves a professional class of fools who are sometimes the only people in England permitted to tell a king the truth. It involves masques so elaborate that the set designs alone could bankrupt a minor lord, and executions staged with such theatrical care that spectators bought the best seats in the house, the way people buy tickets to opera today. It involves secret gardens built for trysts, music written to seduce, and the royal court that ran, quite literally, on performance. Because in Tudor England, entertainment was never simply entertainment. It was power made visible. To understand this world, you have to first understand the stage it was built on. A kingdom rebuilding itself. England in 1485, when Henry Tudor took the crown from the dead hands of Richard III on Bosworth Field, was a battered country. Decades of civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York, the so-called Wars of the Roses, had hollowed out the old nobility, killed off entire bloodlines, and left the throne sitting on a foundation that was, to put it mildly, unstable. Henry VII did not inherit a golden age. He built one, brick by cautious brick, largely through the least glamorous tool available to a medieval monarch, bookkeeping. He hoarded money, he crushed rival claimants, he married his son to a Spanish princess to buy an alliance. He was, by most accounts, not a man who understood how to throw a party. His son fixed that. Henry VIII, who came to the throne in 1509 at 17 years old, was athletic, musical, multilingual, and hungry. For food, for glory, for women, for God's approval, and above all, for spectacle. He had grown up in the shadow of a frugal, watchful father, and the moment he was crowned, he seemed determined to prove that the Tudor dynasty could outglitter every court in Europe. Under Henry VIII and later under his daughter Elizabeth I, the English court became something closer to a permanent, rolling production. Part government, part reality show, part gladiatorial arena, part fashion runway, part house of worship, and part, frankly, orgy of consumption in a country where most people lived on bread, pottage, and the hope of a good harvest. Picture the contrast, because the contrast is the whole story. Outside the palace walls, roughly 90% of English people worked the land. A bad harvest meant real hunger. A single family might own one cooking pot, one bed shared by parents and children alike, a single change of clothes. Life expectancy hovered somewhere in the 30s, dragged down brutally by infant mortality. Plague could empty a village in a season, and inside the walls of Hampton Court, or Whitehall, or none such palace, a palace so extravagant its own name meant there is no such place like it. Courtiers were eating gilded swans, wagering the equivalent of a farmer's lifetime earnings on a single card game, and commissioning musicians to write love songs for affairs they weren't supposed to be having. This gap, this violent, almost surreal gap between the starving cottage and the groaning banqueting table, is the lens through which every act of Tudor entertainment has to be understood. The rich did not simply enjoy themselves. They performed enjoyment, in front of each other, in front of foreign ambassadors who were taking careful notes to report home, and in front of a god they genuinely believed was watching. Pleasure, in this world, was never private. It was a language, and everyone at court was fluent in reading it. Let's step, room by room, ritual by ritual, into what that language actually looked like. The feast, sugar sculptures and political warfare begin in the kitchen, because that is where the performance actually starts, hours before a single guest arrives. A great Tudor feast, the kind thrown for a royal visit, a wedding, or the reception of a foreign ambassador, could involve kitchens the size of small churches, staffed by dozens of cooks working in shifts around the clock. Hampton Court's kitchens, which still stand today and can be walked through by any visitor with the price of admission, sprawled across roughly 3,000 square feet and fed, on an average day, around 600 people twice daily. On feast days, that number could balloon toward 1,000, and the kitchen staff swelled to match. Master cooks, pastry chefs, spit boys turning meat by hand for hours until their skin blistered from the heat, and an army of scullions scrubbing pewter and copper until dawn. The scale of consumption is almost impossible to overstate. Records from Henry VIII's court suggest the royal household could consume, across a single year, over 1,000 cattle, several thousand sheep, thousands of chickens, geese and other fowl, hundreds of pigs, and staggering quantities of fish, especially during Lent, when meat was theoretically forbidden, but fish, including whale, porpoise and seal, technically classified as fish by clever theologians, was not. Wine and ale flowed by the barrel. A single feast might empty tons of Gascon wine that had cost more to import than a labourer would earn in a decade. But raw abundance was never the point. The point was display, and nowhere was display more literal than in the subtlety. A sculpture, usually made of sugar, marzipan or spun sugar paste, presented between courses not to be eaten so much as admired, gasped at, and talked about for years afterward. Sugar in this period was not the cheap commodity it is today. It was imported, expensive, almost medicinal in its rarity, closer in cost to a spice than a staple. To sculpt sugar into castles, ships, coats of arms, or entire mythological scenes was to announce, without saying a word, that you commanded more wealth than your guests could easily calculate. At one famous banquet, a sugar sculpture depicted an entire hunting scene, hounds, stag, huntsmen, rendered in such detail that guests reportedly hesitated before cutting into it. Consider the anecdote, often repeated by historians of the period, of a feast where a subtlety in the shape of St. Paul's Cathedral was wheeled out, its spire taller than a grown man could reach, only to be dismantled piece by piece and distributed as a kind of edible souvenir to the most favoured guests. A final, sugary confirmation of exactly where each person stood in the room's invisible hierarchy. That hierarchy governed everything about the feast, and it was ruthless in its precision. Seating was not casual. Where you sat, how close to the salt cellar, a large decorative container of salt placed near the head of the table, told everyone present exactly how much you mattered. To sit above the salt was to sit among the honoured. To sit below the salt was a quiet public humiliation, one that guests would remember and resent for years. The phrase survives in English to this day, an idiom whose brutal social meaning has faded, but whose shape remains, like a fossil. Courses arrived in a specific, almost liturgical order, and the number of courses served, sometimes 15, 20 or more at the grandest state occasions, was itself a form of boasting. Each dish was seasoned aggressively with imported spices: pepper, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, cloves, nutmeg, mace, all shipped from halfway across the known world at ruinous expense. A wealthy host did not merely want his guests fed. He wanted them to taste, in every mouthful, the reach of his purse, and the length of his trade connections. Heavily spiced meat pies, sauces thickened with almond milk and exotic fruit, roasted swans and peacocks dressed back in their own plumage, elaborate pies from which live birds, or, on the most theatrical occasions, actual musicians could burst out singing. The whole meal was engineered as spectacle, a kind of edible opera performed once and then gone. And beneath the glitter, danger moved quietly through the hall. Poison was a real and present fear among the Tudor elite, particularly at court, where political rivals dined at the same table night after night. Tasters, servants whose job was to sample food and drink before it reached noble lips, were a genuine institution, not a dramatic flourish invented later by novelists. The precious salt cellar itself sometimes doubled as protection, since salt was believed, correctly or not, to have properties that could reveal or neutralize certain poisons. Every gesture of hospitality carried, underneath its silk and sugar, the faint, cold undertow of suspicion. You could be smiling at the man who might, next year, smile back while signing the warrant for your execution. This is the essential truth about Tudor feasting that gets lost in the romantic gloss of costume dramas. The banquet was never a break from politics. It was politics, conducted with forks, or rather without forks, since the fork had barely arrived in England, and most diners still ate with knives, spoons, and their own fingers, wiping their hands on linen napkins, provided in careful, calculated abundance depending on your rank. Music threaded through all of it. Consorts of viols, recorders, and lutes played from a minstrel's gallery, chosen and rehearsed to match the mood of each course, sometimes composed specifically for the occasion by court musicians whose names have mostly been lost. There were few, like the Bassano family, Venetian Jewish musicians recruited into Henry VIII's service, left traces in the historical record that hint at just how international and cosmopolitan the soundscape of the Tudor feast actually was. Between courses there might be interludes, a short comic play, a troupe of tumblers, a joust of wits between the court fool and a willing courtier, or a masque, which deserves, and will get, a chapter entirely of its own. By the time the final subtlety was wheeled away and the tables cleared for dancing, the guests had absorbed hours of carefully calibrated propaganda disguised as hospitality. They had learned who was rising, who was falling, who sat close to the throne, and who had been quietly moved further from it. They had eaten cymbals, and now, as the musicians struck up a new rhythm and the floor cleared, the real performance, the one involving their own bodies, in front of everyone who mattered, was about to begin. Dancing is diplomacy. Watch the floor clear. Watch the rushes, the dried reeds and herbs strewn across the stone to sweeten the air and cushion footsteps, get swept toward the walls. Watch the candlelight catch the sweat already forming on the brow of a young courtier who knows, with total certainty, that in the next 10 minutes his entire career at court may rise or fall on how gracefully he can perform a pavane. Dance in Tudor England was not a diversion from serious business. It was serious business, disguised as a diversion. Henry VIII himself was, by every surviving account, a genuinely gifted and enthusiastic dancer. Tall, athletic, and light on his feet in his younger years, and he expected his court to keep pace with him, sometimes literally. Ambassadors reported watching the young king dance until the small hours, changing partners, showing off leaps and turns with an energy that seems almost aggressive in its need to be admired. To dance well at the Tudor court was to demonstrate breeding, discipline, physical fitness and, crucially, the leisure time and private tutoring required to master an art that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with status. The dances themselves ranged from the stately to the athletic. The pavane, a slow, processional dance performed in couples, allowed dancers to display fine clothing and dignified bearing. It was, in a sense, a walking advertisement, the human equivalent of a sugar sculpture. Partners moved with deliberate slowness, precisely so that every jewel, every embroidered sleeve, every carefully arranged headdress could be studied by the watching crowd. The galliard, by contrast, was fast, athletic, full of jumps and kicks, and it rewarded youth, fitness, and a certain daring. Elizabeth I, famously, continued dancing galliards well into her 50s and 60s, reportedly as both exercise and as a pointed public demonstration that she remained vigorous and fit to rule, in an age when a monarch's physical body was widely read as a symbol of the health of the state itself. There is a particularly telling anecdote from the Elizabethan court, recorded by a foreign visitor, describing the aging queen dancing briskly early each morning for exercise, alone but for a few attendants. A private ritual of vitality that, when word of it leaked out, was almost certainly allowed to leak precisely because it served her image. In a court where every gesture was read as text, even solitary exercise became a kind of broadcast. To dance at court, a young nobleman or noblewoman needed formal training, and dancing masters, often Italian or French, since continental dance styles were considered the height of sophistication, were hired at considerable expense to drill the steps into children from a young age. Getting the choreography wrong in front of the assembled court was not a minor social slip. It could brand a young courtier as provincial, poorly bred, or simply unfit for advancement. Marriages were quite literally arranged on dance floors, as parents and matchmakers watched potential matches move together, reading physical compatibility, temperament, and grace as proxies for the qualities that mattered in a spouse. A clumsy partner might find a promising match quietly withdrawn before the music even finished. Masked balls and disguisings added another layer of intrigue. Under the cover of a mask, or dressed as a shepherdess, a Moorish prince, or a classical goddess in an elaborate mumming, courtiers could flirt, needle rivals, or even approach the monarch with a boldness that would be unthinkable in ordinary dress. Henry VIII in his younger years delighted in bursting into his own court disguised as a stranger, a shepherd, an outlaw, a foreign lord, pretending with theatrical unconvincingness that no one recognised him, while the entire hall played along in an elaborate game of collective, flattering pretense. It reads, from 5 centuries' distance, as faintly absurd. It was also, in its way, a genuine release valve, a socially sanctioned space where the boundary between king and subject blurred just enough to let both sides breathe. And underneath the choreography, always, ran currents of real desire and real danger. It was on a dance floor that Henry VIII first began paying visible attention to Anne Boleyn, a woman who had returned from the sophisticated French court with dancing skills that reportedly outshone every other lady present. Her movement, her wit, her refusal to simply melt into the background the way court etiquette expected of women, these qualities, performed in full view of the assembled nobility, were part of what pulled the king's eye toward her, setting in motion a chain of events that would end in a break with Rome, the birth of the Church of England, and eventually Anne's own execution on a scaffold within the Tower walls. A dance step, magnified through the peculiar physics of Tudor court life, could alter the religious trajectory of an entire nation. Musicians for these dances were themselves prized court assets. Instruments of choice included the lute, intimate, portable, capable of both accompaniment and virtuosic solo display, alongside viols, recorders, sackbuts, an early trombone, shawms, a piercing double-reed ancestor of the oboe, favoured for outdoor and processional music, and increasingly, keyboard instruments like the virginal, a small harpsichord that became something of a status symbol in wealthy households. Composers such as Thomas Tallis worked within, and sometimes despite, the shifting religious politics of the era, writing music that had to satisfy Catholic sensibilities under Mary I and Protestant sensibilities under Elizabeth I, often within the space of a single decade. Music, like dance, like food, was never simply art for art's sake. It was diplomacy in a minor key, performed on a floor where the wrong step could cost you everything. By the time the last galliard ended, and exhausted courtiers drifted toward wine cups and quiet corners, the evening's dancing had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had displayed wealth. It had tested bodies. It had brokered marriages, ignited rivalries, and occasionally rewritten the future of a kingdom, all while looking, to the untrained eye, like nothing more than a party. The Masque, when kings played gods. Move now from the dance floor into a darker, more theatrical space, a temporary world built entirely out of paint, canvas, candlelight, and ambition. The masque was the single most expensive form of entertainment the Tudor and early Stuart courts produced, and understanding it means understanding that the Tudor elite did not simply watch performances, they performed in them. A masque combined elaborate scenery, allegorical costume, poetry, music and dance into a single event, often built around a mythological or classical theme. Diana and her nymphs, the triumph of peace over war, the gods of Olympus descending to bless the English court. Crucially, the leading roles were frequently taken not by professional actors, but by the king, queen, and highest nobility themselves, masked and costumed, performing before an audience of their own courtiers and foreign dignitaries. Think about what that means. The most powerful people in the kingdom were, on these nights, quite literally casting themselves as gods. Henry VIII appearing as a shepherd prince or an allegorical figure of youth. Courtiers dressed as classical deities, descending from painted clouds on machinery that could take weeks to construct and often broke down mid-performance. The symbolism was never subtle, and it was never meant to be. A masque celebrating a royal marriage might feature figures representing concord and fertility, blessing the union. A masque staged during a period of political tension might, more pointedly, depict the triumph of loyal subjects over rebellious ones, or the inevitable victory of a virtuous monarch over foreign threats. Watching a masque unfold was, for a sharp-eyed courtier or ambassador, an exercise in political reading as much as aesthetic pleasure. Every allegorical figure was a coded message about who was in favour, what alliance was being celebrated, or what warning was being quietly delivered. The production costs were genuinely staggering, and account books that survive from the period offer a rare, precise window into just how much a single night's fantasy could cost. Costumes were built from cloth of gold and silver, real silk, and hundreds of yards of fabric dyed in expensive colours. The deep reds from imported cochineal, the blues from lapis-derived pigments, the golds from actual gold thread woven directly into the cloth. Masks and headdresses were elaborately constructed, sometimes incorporating real jewels, borrowed or purchased for a single night's wear. Scenery included painted backdrops depicting classical temples, mythical forests, and heavenly clouds, along with increasingly ambitious stage machinery, clouds that could be lowered on ropes and pulleys, thrones that rotated, trapdoors through which performers could seem to vanish into an underworld. By the early Stuart period, the designer Inigo Jones would push this machinery to spectacular, almost cinematic extremes. But the Tudor court had already established the basic appetite: spend recklessly, astonish completely, and let the astonishment reflect back onto the monarch's glory. One particularly revealing episode comes from early in Henry VIII's reign, when the young king and a group of companions, dressed as outlandish foreign visitors, Russian ambassadors or Turkish lords depending on the account, burst uninvited into a court entertainment hosted by Cardinal Wolsey, pretending to be exotic strangers, while the assembled company played along with exaggerated theatrical surprise. The king unmasked himself at the climax, to gasps of recognition from courtiers who had, of course, known exactly who he was the entire time. It is a small, almost embarrassing anecdote on its surface, but it reveals something important. The masque blurred the line between formal state theatre and pure improvised play, and it did so specifically because the king enjoyed both the fantasy of anonymity and the guaranteed, choreographed applause of being unmasked as himself. Masques also served as crucial venues for courtship and matchmaking, since the intimacy of shared performance, rehearsing together, dancing together in character, standing close under torchlight in costume, offered socially sanctioned proximity between men and women that ordinary court etiquette would never permit. Fathers negotiating marriage alliances paid close attention to which young courtiers were cast opposite which young ladies, reading the pairing itself as a subtle diplomatic signal. Beneath the spectacle, though, lay real financial devastation for some of the families involved in producing these entertainments, particularly by the later Elizabethan and early Jacobean periods, when the fashion for ever more elaborate masques accelerated into something close to competitive ruin. Noble hosts who wished to impress the Queen, or later King James, by staging a masque at their own expense, could spend sums equivalent to a modest estate's entire annual income on a single night's entertainment. Sums that, once spent, could never be recovered, since a masque, unlike a portrait or a piece of plate, left nothing behind but memory and debt. Costumes were sometimes torn apart by souvenir-hungry guests before the night was even over. Jewels went missing in the chaos, and the elaborate temporary stage work was simply dismantled and discarded once its single night of glory had passed. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that detail when you sit with it. An entire fictional world. Gods, temples, enchanted forests, a whole cosmology of allegory, built at ruinous expense, performed once by real human beings, playing at divinity in front of an audience that understood every layer of the joke and the flattery and the warning embedded in it. And then, by morning, gone, swept away like the sugar sculpture. Nothing survives of most Tudor masques now except a handful of account book entries listing yards of cloth and pounds of gold thread, a few surviving costume sketches, and second-hand descriptions in ambassadors' letters home, fragile paper ghosts of a spectacle that, for one single night, made kings and queens into gods, and made their courtiers, for a few hours at least, believe it. The hunt, blood, land, and the body of the king. Step outside now, out of the candlelit hall and into grey morning light, the smell of wet grass and horse sweat, the baying of hounds straining against their leashes. If the feast displayed wealth and the masque displayed imagination, the hunt displayed something more primal, the body itself and the land beneath it. Hunting was not, for the Tudor elite, a hobby in the modern leisure sense. It was a rite, jealously guarded and legally enforced, that marked the boundary between nobility and everyone else. Vast tracts of English countryside, royal forests, deer parks, chases, were set aside by law for the exclusive hunting pleasure of the crown, and the privileged few granted access to them. Poaching a deer from a royal forest could bring savage punishment, because a deer within those boundaries was not merely meat, it was a living symbol of the monarch's exclusive dominion over the land itself. Ordinary people starving on the edges of a hard winter could, in theory, be maimed or executed for taking a single animal that a nobleman would later kill for sport and barely bother to eat. Henry VIII, in his younger years, was reportedly one of the most tireless hunters in Europe, capable of wearing out as many as 8 or 10 horses in a single day's chase, pursuing stag through royal forests with a physical stamina that ambassadors described with genuine astonishment. Hunting was, for him and for his court, simultaneously athletic training for war, a demonstration of masculine vigour, a social ritual, and pure, exhilarating pleasure. The chase could last hours, covering many miles of countryside, the hunting party thundering across fields and through woodland, hounds baying, horns sounding coded signals that told riders scattered across the landscape exactly what stage of the hunt was underway, whether the quarry had been sighted, whether it had been brought to bay, whether the kill was imminent. The killing itself followed elaborate ritual. When a stag was finally cornered or exhausted, the unmaking, the ceremonial breaking up of the carcass, followed a strict, almost liturgical order, with specific cuts of meat allotted to specific ranks of hunter according to status, and certain portions traditionally given to the hounds as reward, a moment of genuine ceremony that reinforced, yet again, the hierarchy running through every layer of Tudor life. A young nobleman's first successful kill, and his correct performance of the unmaking ritual, functioned almost as a rite of passage into full adult status among his peers. Falconry offered a quieter, more intimate cousin to the mounted chase, and it came with its own rigid hierarchy, famously, if apocryphally in some details, codified in later texts that assigned specific birds of prey to specific social ranks. The eagle for an emperor, the gerfalcon for a king, the peregrine for an earl, the merlin for a lady, down through hierarchies of hawk and hound to the humble kestrel, supposedly fit only for a servant. Whether or not this rigid table was ever strictly enforced in daily life, the cultural logic behind it was entirely real. A nobleman's hawk, carried on his gloved wrist, hooded and jessed with jewel-studded leather, was as much a marker of rank as his sword or his horse. Training a hawk took months of patient, skilled labour, and a well-trained bird represented a genuine investment of money and time that only the wealthy could sustain. Elizabeth I, despite the physical limitations imposed on women's participation in the roughest forms of the mounted chase, was nonetheless a passionate and skilled horsewoman and huntress well into middle age, and foreign visitors to her court recorded with some surprise her stamina in the saddle, riding out to hunt as a deliberate display, much like her early morning dancing, of continued vigour and fitness to rule. A queen who could outride her courtiers was a queen who silenced, at least for an afternoon, any whispered doubts about her physical capacity to govern a kingdom in a world that instinctively distrusted female rule. Beyond the practical display of horsemanship and stamina, the hunt carried a rich symbolic freight throughout Tudor culture, appearing constantly as metaphor in the poetry, portraiture, and courtly love conventions of the age. The pursued deer standing in for a coy mistress, the huntsman for a desperate lover, a metaphorical vocabulary borrowed from continental traditions and deployed endlessly in sonnets and masques alike. Thomas Wyatt's famous poem describing a hind wearing a collar reading "Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, touch me not, for I belong to Caesar," is widely read by scholars as a coded reference to Anne Boleyn's position as the king's chosen forbidden quarry, hunting imagery repurposed to describe the most dangerous romantic pursuit in English history. And always, running beneath the athletic pleasure and the poetic metaphor, was the harder economic reality. Hunting parks required enormous tracts of enclosed land that could otherwise have grown crops or grazed livestock for common use, land whose enclosure for aristocratic pleasure directly displaced the rural poor, in an era already convulsed by the broader enclosure movement, as landlords fenced off common land for private profit, driving small farmers off holdings their families had worked for generations. A deer park's beauty, from the perspective of the peasant who once grazed a few sheep on that same ground, was not neutral scenery. It was a visible, fenced monument to exactly whose pleasure the land now existed to serve. The tournament, armoured theatre and the politics of splendour now hear trumpets of a different kind, sharper, more martial, and picture tilt yards, those long fenced arenas built specifically for jousting, packed with spectators on tiered wooden stands, banners snapping overhead, the air thick with dust and the smell of horse and hot metal. The joust and the broader tournament culture surrounding it represented the Tudor elite's most direct inheritance from medieval chivalric tradition, but by the 16th century it had evolved into something closer to a fully staged theatrical spectacle than genuine battlefield practice, even as it retained real physical danger. Henry VIII again threw himself into this world with an almost reckless enthusiasm in his youth, competing personally in tournaments under invented theatrical identities, jousting incognito as an anonymous challenger before dramatically revealing himself as the king, to the entirely predictable astonishment of the crowd, a device that echoes the same pattern of performed anonymity found in the mask and the disguising. The physical risk was real and occasionally catastrophic. In January 1536, Henry VIII suffered a serious jousting accident, falling from his horse in full armour and being crushed beneath the animal, knocked unconscious for a reported 2 hours, in an era when such an injury could easily have been fatal. Some historians have argued this accident and a related earlier head injury may have caused lasting neurological damage that contributed to the erratic, increasingly volatile temperament of his later years. A single fall from a horse, in other words, potentially altering the psychological trajectory of the English Reformation and the fates of several of his subsequent wives. The accident is also linked, in the traditional but disputed telling, to Anne Boleyn's miscarriage days later, a loss that further destabilised her already precarious position at court. Whether or not every link in that chain holds up to modern scrutiny, the anecdote captures something essential. Even the most controlled, ritualised Tudor spectacle carried genuine mortal stakes. Tournament armour itself represented one of the great luxury industries of the age, commissioned from specialist workshops, including, for the wealthiest patrons, workshops on the continent renowned for elaborate etched and gilded decoration, at costs that could rival the price of a substantial house. Henry VIII's own surviving armour, preserved today and viewable by museum visitors, shows both his genuine athletic build in youth and, In later suits, the dramatically expanding waistline of his middle age, an inadvertent but oddly moving record of one man's physical decline, preserved in cold steel across 4 decades of a single reign. Tournaments were staged as much for propaganda as for sport, none more famously than the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, a meeting between Henry VIII and King Francis I of France near Calais, ostensibly a diplomatic summit meant to cement peace between the two rival monarchies, but staged instead as an almost absurdly competitive display of tournament pageantry, feasting, and temporary architecture. Both kings arrived with enormous retinues, thousands of attendants, and temporary palaces constructed from wood, canvas, and glass specifically for the occasion. Structures so elaborate and gilded that the meeting took its lasting name from the sheer quantity of cloth of gold on display, fabric literally woven with gold thread, worn and displayed in such profusion that observers struggled to describe it without hyperbole. Jousts, wrestling matches, and archery contests filled the days, while feasts and entertainments filled the nights. The entire multi-week event functioning as a kind of Renaissance summit meeting, reimagined as a sporting and fashion competition, each king desperate to visibly outspend and outsplendour the other, even while formally proclaiming eternal friendship. The peace it supposedly cemented did not, in fact, last particularly long, but the spectacle itself became legendary, remembered centuries later as shorthand for reckless, competitive extravagance. Women, while barred from participating directly in the joust itself, played an essential ceremonial role as patrons and symbolic inspiration, presenting favours, a scarf, a jewelled token, a sleeve, to knights who would then wear the token visibly during combat, publicly declaring, through this small piece of fabric, whose honour they claimed to be fighting for. This custom offered one more of the era's many socially sanctioned channels for flirtation to be conducted in full public view, the token itself functioning as a coded, deniable message, legible to everyone in the stands who cared to read it. By the later Elizabethan period, actual mounted combat in the older, more dangerous style had given way increasingly to more elaborately theatrical tournament forms, including the Accession Day tilts, annual tournaments held to celebrate the anniversary of Elizabeth's accession to the throne, which combined jousting with elaborate allegorical costume, poetry, and pageant devices, celebrating the Queen as an almost sacred, untouchable figure of chivalric devotion. Each competing knight required to present an impressa, a symbolic device and accompanying verse explaining his chosen persona for the day. The tournament, in other words, had, by Elizabeth's reign, become almost fully absorbed into the same theatrical, allegorical universe as the masque. Martial sport reimagined as devotional performance aims not at demonstrating battlefield readiness, so much as reinforcing, year after year, the Queen's carefully constructed cult of semi-divine, eternally youthful, royal authority. Gambling, fortunes won and lost on a single throw. Now step into a smaller, quieter room, quieter but no less dangerous. Here, around a table lit by a single branch of candles, cards are being dealt, dice are being cast, and fortunes are changing hands with a speed that would make even the most reckless jouster nervous. Gambling ran through Tudor court life like a fever, and it was, by a wide margin, one of the most financially destructive entertainments the wealthy indulged in, more ruinous in many individual cases than even the most extravagant masque or feast, because gambling losses compounded with a viciousness that a single night's overspending on sugar sculpture never could. Card games, dice games, and betting on virtually anything, tennis matches, cockfights, the sex of an unborn child, the outcome of a foreign war, consumed enormous sums among courtiers, who often had far less real income than their extravagant lifestyles suggested. Henry VIII himself gambled heavily throughout his reign, and the detailed household accounts that survive from his court record specific, sometimes startling losses at cards and dice, including nights where the king lost sums that would have represented a comfortable annual income for a country gentleman, all wagered and gone within a few hours. Card games of the period included various forms of what would evolve into games still recognisable today, while dice games, sometimes played with loaded or false dice, a form of cheating well documented and repeatedly, if ineffectively legislated against, offered an even faster, more brutal mechanism for transferring wealth around the gaming table. Elizabeth I, by contrast, was reportedly a shrewder and more controlled gambler than her father, said to enjoy cards but to play with a canny awareness of when to stop, a trait some courtiers and later commentators read as characteristic of her broader political caution, her famous reluctance to commit irrevocably to any single dramatic course of action, when a more patient, calculated approach might preserve her position. Whether the anecdote is entirely reliable, it fits a pattern. Contemporaries consistently read gambling behaviour as a window into character, a diagnostic tool for judging a courtier's or a monarch's self-discipline, judgment, and fitness for responsibility. The social function of gambling extended well beyond simple financial risk. Gaming tables offered another arena, alongside the dance floor and the masque, where courtiers could position themselves near the monarch, engage in conversation under the relatively relaxed etiquette that gameplay permitted, and either advance their standing through a well-timed loss to a powerful patron. Deliberately losing to flatter a superior was a recognised, if quietly cynical, court strategy, or occasionally embarrass themselves catastrophically through visible desperation or inability to pay debts of honour. Gambling debts among the nobility were treated with a seriousness that could exceed even other financial obligations, since failure to pay a gambling debt promptly branded a gentleman as fundamentally dishonourable in a culture that placed enormous weight on reputation and honour as tangible social currency. Entire estates changed hands, or came dangerously close to it, over sustained gambling losses, and moralists and preachers of the period railed regularly against the vice from the pulpit, warning that gaming led young gentlemen to ruin, encouraged idleness, and corrupted households from the top down. Sermons and pamphlets on the dangers of gaming form a substantial genre of their own in the surviving literature of the period, evidence both of how widespread the practice was and how little the warnings actually curbed it. Parliament periodically attempted to legislate against excessive gaming, particularly among servants and apprentices, whose participation in games nominally reserved for their social betters was seen as a dangerous form of imitation, likely to lead to theft and disorder further down the social scale, even as the aristocracy's own gambling excesses went largely unchecked by the same laws. Betting culture extended naturally outward into the sporting entertainments already described. Spectators at tournaments, at tennis matches, a genuinely fashionable sport among the Tudor elite, with Henry VIII maintaining dedicated tennis courts, some of which survive today at Hampton Court, and at the blood sports we will turn to next, routinely wagered substantial sums on outcomes, turning nearly every competitive spectacle at court into a secondary financial event layered on top of the primary entertainment. In a world without stock markets or modern investment vehicles readily available to individuals, gambling offered the Tudor elite one of their only outlets for the particular, addictive thrill of risking capital on an uncertain outcome. A thrill that, for some families, proved every bit as ruinous as a bad harvest was for a tenant farmer, if considerably more avoidable. Theirs in chains, the blood sports of the elite crossed the river now, literally, since in London much of this entertainment clustered on the south bank of the Thames, beyond the direct jurisdiction of the city's more puritanical authorities, and enter a wooden amphitheatre, ringing with a sound unlike anything in the banqueting hall, the deep, furious roar of a chained bear, and the answering frenzy of dogs sent in to attack it. Bear baiting and bull baiting were, to modern sensibilities, among the most shocking entertainments the Tudor elite openly enjoyed, and yet the evidence is unambiguous. These blood sports were not a lower-class vice, merely tolerated by the aristocracy from a polite distance. They were embraced, funded, and attended enthusiastically by the highest levels of English society, including the monarchy itself. Henry VIII maintained his own royal bear pit, and both he and Elizabeth I are documented as having entertained foreign ambassadors with baiting spectacles as a deliberate, prestigious form of court hospitality. Proof, in its own brutal way, of just how normalised this violence was among people who also, in the very same afternoon, might discuss Latin poetry or admire a new tapestry. The mechanics of the spectacle were straightforward and horrific. A bear, or sometimes a bull, would be chained by the leg or neck to a stake in the centre of a circular pit, unable to flee, while a succession of large, specially bred dogs, mastiffs primarily, ancestors of several dog breeds still recognised today, were released to attack it. The bear would fight back with claws and teeth, frequently killing or maiming several dogs before eventually being overwhelmed exhausted, or, in some documented cases, surviving to fight again on another day, since a particularly strong or crafty bear that repeatedly won its fights against multiple dogs could become something close to a celebrity, known by name to regular spectators and valued as a reusable investment by the pit's owner, rather than being killed off after a single bout. Elizabeth I, in particular, is recorded as having been genuinely fond of bear baiting as entertainment, staging it repeatedly for visiting dignitaries, and on at least one occasion, reportedly overruling advisors who suggested cancelling a scheduled baiting out of deference to a visiting French delegation's sensibilities. The Queen insisted the spectacle proceed, apparently confident that her foreign guests would find it as entertaining as her own court did, which, by most surviving accounts, they did. The famous London Bear Pits and the Paris Garden on the Bankside operated for decades as established, licensed venues, drawing crowds across the full span of London's social hierarchy, with the wealthiest spectators paying for better seats and closer views, exactly as they would at a theatre or a tournament, treating animal death as a form of premium, ticketed entertainment. Cockfighting occupied similar cultural ground, if on a smaller and less visually overwhelming scale, with specially bred and trained fighting cocks fitted with sharpened metal spurs set against one another in specially constructed cockpits, while spectators wagered heavily on the outcome. Henry VIII built a dedicated cockpit at Whitehall Palace specifically for the sport, a permanent architectural commitment to the entertainment that underscores just how integrated it was into ordinary royal leisure. Not a rare indulgence, but a regular fixture of court life, staged with the same seriousness of purpose as a hunt or a tournament. It is worth pausing here on the genuine cognitive dissonance this presents to modern audiences, and being honest about it rather than smoothing it away. These were, in many cases, the same people who wept over devotional poetry, who commissioned exquisitely tender portraits of their children, who patronised some of the greatest music and architecture Europe had yet produced, and who also, without any apparent sense of contradiction, considered watching a chained animal torn apart by dogs to be a perfectly appropriate afternoon's entertainment for a queen and her foreign guests. Understanding Tudor entertainment honestly means resisting the urge to sand down this contradiction, either by pretending the violence was somehow less brutal than it was, or by refusing to acknowledge the genuine sophistication and emotional depth of the culture that produced it alongside the violence. Both things were true simultaneously, and the Tudor elite apparently felt no particular need to reconcile them. Public execution, which functioned in this period as its own distinct and enormously popular form of civic spectacle, sat on a disturbing continuum with these blood sports, sharing much of the same crowd psychology, the same appetite for staged, ritualized violence witnessed collectively, a subject substantial enough and important enough to Tudor court life specifically, that it deserves its own dedicated examination later in this account. For now, though, note simply this. The wooden bear pits of Southwark stood, quite literally, a short walk and a river crossing from the polished dance floors and gilded banqueting halls already described, and the same aristocratic feet that moved through a stately pavan on one evening might, days later, stand at the rail of a bear pit, cheering as dogs and bear tore into one another below. The Tudor appetite for spectacle recognised no firm boundary between beauty and brutality. Both were, in their own ways, simply forms of theatre, and the wealthy, who could afford the best seats to any show in the kingdom, made sure they never missed one. The fool's licence, the only man allowed to tell the king the truth. Return now to the hall, but look toward its margins, where a smaller, stranger figure moves, motley dressed, perhaps carrying a marotte, a mock sceptre topped with a carved fool's head, weaving between courtiers with a freedom no duke or bishop in the room actually possesses. The court fool occupied one of the most paradoxical positions in Tudor society, a person of low formal status who nonetheless held a kind of protected speech that even the highest nobles could not safely exercise. Will Somer, Henry VIII's most famous jester, appears repeatedly in the historical record and in period portraiture, including, notably, in a large family portrait of Henry VIII with his children, where Somer stands included among the royal family in a way that speaks to his genuinely intimate, trusted position within the household, not merely as hired entertainment, but as something closer to a fixture of domestic life, present at the king's most private and most public moments alike. The fool's essential social function was to say what no one else dared say. Under the specific, understood convention of fool's license, a jester could mock the king's decisions, comment on unpopular policies, tease favoured courtiers about their pretensions, or point, however obliquely, at uncomfortable political truths, all protected by the fiction that his words carried no real weight because he was, after all, merely a fool. This convention gave the Tudor court one of its only reliable internal mechanisms for something resembling honest feedback delivered directly to the monarch. A courtier who criticised the king risked imprisonment or worse, but a fool who delivered the same criticism wrapped in a joke, a rhyme, or an absurd riddle could sometimes get away with saying things that would have ended anyone else's career or life on the spot. Anecdotal evidence, some more reliable than others, credits Will Summer with genuinely influencing royal mood and occasionally royal decisions through his particular talent for deflating tension with a well-timed joke, and later accounts describe him as one of the few people capable of approaching Henry VIII during the king's darkest, most volatile periods without provoking his famous rages. Whether every specific anecdote attached to Summer across the centuries is strictly accurate, the broader pattern is well documented across multiple Tudor and Stuart courts. Fools functioned as emotional pressure valves in an environment of constant, high-stakes political tension, offering both the monarch and the wider court a legitimate outlet for laughter, criticism, and release that the rigid formal etiquette of court life otherwise made almost impossible. Not all court fools performed the same role or came from the same background. Some, described in period sources as natural fools, were individuals with intellectual disabilities kept at court for entertainment in a manner that reads, from a modern vantage point, as deeply uncomfortable and exploitative. Their genuine cognitive differences treated as a source of comic spectacle by an aristocracy that saw little contradiction between casual cruelty toward the vulnerable and genuine affection for a favoured individual fool. Others, described as artificial fools, were skilled professional performers, often sharp, well-read wits who deliberately adopted foolish behaviour, costume and speech as a calculated performance and career, choosing the role for the genuine social access and protected speech it offered, rather than being pressed into it by disability or circumstance. The blurred, often uncomfortable line between these categories tells its own story about how casually the Tudor elite could combine real cruelty with real intimacy toward the same individuals. Female fools and jesters also appear in the historical record, if less prominently than their male counterparts. Jane the Fool served in the households of both Anne Boleyn and later Catherine Parr, receiving payment for elaborate costumes and appearing in household accounts with a regularity that confirms her genuine, ongoing status within the royal domestic establishment, rather than being a rare novelty. Beyond individual jesters, the broader tradition of licensed foolishness extended into structured seasonal customs, most notably the Lord of Misrule, a temporary figure, often chosen from among the household servants, or, at the universities and inns of court, from among the students, appointed to preside over the riotous entertainments of the 12 days of Christmas, with authority for the duration of the season to organise games, order mock punishments, demand entertainment from actual social superiors, and generally invert the usual hierarchy of the household in a controlled, temporary, and ultimately safety valve fashion. For those 12 days, a stable boy might command a knight to perform a forfeit. A kitchen servant might issue mock decrees to which even the lord of the house was expected, within the bounds of the game, to submit. This deliberate, sanctioned inversion of hierarchy, repeated annually across noble households and university colleges throughout the Tudor period, offered a pressure release mechanism remarkably similar in function to the fool's individual license, a controlled outlet for the tensions that a famously rigid social order inevitably generated, tensions that, left entirely unreleased, might have found far less controlled avenues for expression. The fool, in every one of these forms, reveals something the rest of Tudor entertainment mostly conceals, an acknowledgement, however grudging, that absolute hierarchy and absolute seriousness were themselves dangerous if maintained without any release valve at all. Even a court obsessed with rank, precedence, and display understood, on some level, that it needed at least one person in the room permitted to say the unsayable, and that it was safer, in the end, to let a man in motley say it with a joke than to let the pressure build until someone said it without one. Theatre, poetry, and the art of performed devotion. Walk now toward a smaller, more intimate stage, not the public playhouses that would come to define the later Elizabethan era for posterity, but the private entertainments performed within noble households and, above all, at court itself, where drama served purposes considerably more targeted than simple public amusement. Interludes. Short dramatic pieces, often comic or moral in theme, performed between courses at a feast or as standalone evening entertainment, represent one of the earliest and most persistent forms of Tudor courtly drama, predating and then running parallel to the rise of the great public playhouses in London later in the 16th century. These pieces, sometimes performed by professional touring companies retained under noble patronage, and sometimes by courtiers or students themselves, ranged from broad comedy to pointed moral allegory, occasionally straying into genuinely risky political or religious territory that required careful navigation given the era's shifting and dangerous religious politics. By the reign of Elizabeth I, the relationship between court and public theatre had become genuinely symbiotic and mutually dependent in ways that shaped the entire trajectory of English drama. Companies of players required noble or royal patronage to operate legally at all. The law required travelling performers to be formally attached to a patron's household or risk prosecution as vagrants, a legal reality that directly explains why acting companies of the period carried names like the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the company with which William Shakespeare was most closely associated for the bulk of his career, or the Admiral's Men, patronised by the Lord Admiral. This patronage system meant that the same plays being performed for paying, socially mixed public audiences at venues like the Globe were also, quite often, performed privately at court for the Queen and her assembled nobility, sometimes with modifications made specifically to flatter or avoid offending royal sensibilities. Elizabeth I herself was a genuinely enthusiastic patron and audience for drama, and court performances were a regular, expected feature of the Christmas season and other significant occasions throughout her reign, with companies competing for the considerable prestige and the very real financial reward of being selected to perform before the Queen. A successful court performance could substantially boost a company's public reputation and box office fortunes. A performance that offended or bored the Queen could, conversely, damage a company's standing considerably. The stakes of performing for royalty were, in this very direct sense, financial as much as artistic. Music and poetry occupied similarly dual roles as both intimate personal expression and calculated public performance throughout the Tudor elite's cultural life. Henry VIII himself composed music. The popular attribution of greensleeves to the king is almost certainly a later myth, unsupported by the musical evidence, but he genuinely did compose surviving pieces, including part songs preserved in a manuscript collection now known as the Henry VIII Songbook, and he was recognised by contemporaries as a genuinely accomplished musician on multiple instruments, not merely a royal dilettante indulged by flattering courtiers. Poetry, meanwhile, functioned at the Tudor court as an especially precise instrument of coded courtship, political manoeuvring, and personal risk. Thomas Wyatt's verse, much of it circulated only in private manuscript form among a select court readership, rather than published for a wider public, is widely read by literary historians as reflecting his own dangerous entanglement with Anne Boleyn before her marriage to the king, poetry that had to communicate genuine, potentially treasonous personal feeling through layers of classical and Petrarchan convention, precise enough to maintain plausible deniability if the wrong reader ever saw it. The stakes of a badly chosen metaphor in this context were not merely aesthetic, they could be genuinely, physically lethal. Later in the century, the flowering of Elizabethan poetry associated with figures like Edmund Spenser, Philip Sidney, and eventually Shakespeare himself, built directly on this courtly foundation, even as poetry and drama increasingly found audiences and patrons beyond the immediate royal circle. Sidney's own life and death. He died from a wound sustained in battle in the Netherlands in 1586, having already established himself as both a celebrated poet and the very model of chivalric courtier virtue that Elizabethan culture idealised, reads almost as a real-life enactment of the same fusion of martial valour, poetic sensibility, and courtly devotion that the tournament culture, the masque, and the Petrarchan sonnet tradition had all, in their different ways, been celebrating and rehearsing throughout the century. What unites theatre, music and poetry across the Tudor period, distinguishing courtly performance culture from what would later become recognised as art produced primarily for its own sake, is the sheer inescapability of political and social calculation running beneath even the most personally felt creative expression. A love sonnet might be a genuine outpouring of private feeling and, simultaneously, a carefully calculated bid for royal favour circulated to exactly the right audience. A masque's mythological allegory might be gorgeous spectacle and, simultaneously, a precisely targeted piece of political messaging. In Tudor England, among the class of people wealthy and powerful enough to commission or perform such art, the line between authentic feeling and calculated performance was never entirely stable, and perhaps, given how thoroughly every aspect of elite life was subject to public scrutiny and interpretation, it could never have been. Fashion as warfare, silk, slashing, and the sumptuary laws. Look now at the bodies moving through this world, not what they did, but what they wore while doing it, because in Tudor England, clothing itself was a form of entertainment, competition, and open economic warfare conducted entirely through fabric. The sheer expense of elite Tudor dress is difficult to overstate. A single formal court gown, constructed from imported silk velvet, embroidered with gold and silver thread, trimmed with fur, often sable, ermine, or lynx imported at extraordinary cost, and studded with jewels, could cost more than many skilled tradesmen would earn across several years of steady labour. Wardrobes belonging to the wealthiest courtiers and to the monarchy itself ran to hundreds of individual garments, catalogued in detailed inventories that survive today, and offer historians an almost forensic level of insight into exactly how much fabric, thread, and jewellery a single powerful individual might own and display across a single year of court appearances. Elizabeth I's wardrobe at the time of her death reportedly contained close to 2,000 individual gowns, an almost incomprehensible quantity of specialised, expensive clothing, maintained specifically to ensure the Queen never had to be seen in public, repeating an outfit in a way that might suggest declining resources or fading royal magnificence. Fashion trends moved with real speed among the elite, borrowing heavily and self-consciously from continental styles, Spanish, French and Italian influences cycling in and out of favour, partly in step with the shifting diplomatic alliances and rivalries of the moment, so that a courtier's choice of sleeve shape or rough style could carry a faint, legible echo of contemporary foreign policy. The Spanish farthingale, a structured underskirt that created a rigid, bell-shaped silhouette, gave way over the century to increasingly exaggerated variations, while the ruff, that now iconic starched pleated collar most associated with Elizabethan portraiture, grew, decade by decade, into increasingly enormous and structurally elaborate forms, requiring specialised starching techniques imported from the Low Countries and a small supporting industry of laundresses skilled specifically in maintaining the delicate, labour-intensive pleating. Slashing, the fashion of cutting deliberate slits into an outer garment to reveal contrasting, often brightly coloured fabric beneath, became a signature Tudor style, particularly popular among men, and it offers a small but telling window into the era's underlying logic of display. The technique deliberately damaged expensive fabric in order to reveal that the wearer could afford still more expensive fabric layered underneath, destruction itself repurposed as a form of conspicuous consumption. Codpieces, elaborately padded and decorated coverings worn at the front of men's hose, grew during Henry VIII's reign into genuinely exaggerated proportions, functioning as an unmistakably direct visual statement of virility that modern viewers of Tudor portraiture often find startling in its bluntness. Because clothing carried this much unmistakable social and political weight, the English crown attempted repeatedly, across the entire Tudor period to legally regulate who was permitted to wear what, through a body of legislation historians collectively refer to as the sumptuary laws. These statutes specified, in often extraordinary detail, exactly which fabrics, colours and furs were reserved for which ranks of society. Purple silk and cloth of gold reserved essentially for the royal family and highest nobility, certain furs restricted to those above a specified income threshold, velvet and other luxury fabrics carefully rationed downward through the social hierarchy according to precise, legally codified gradations of rank and wealth. The stated justification for these laws typically invoked concerns about wasteful spending, the destabilising social confusion that might arise if rank became visually illegible, and the drain that imported luxury textiles placed on the kingdom's finite supply of gold and silver. But the underlying anxiety was unmistakably about maintaining a visually legible, stable social hierarchy in a period when a newly wealthy merchant class was increasingly capable of affording the same fine fabrics as an impoverished but well-born aristocrat, threatening to make wealth, rather than birth, the true visible marker of status. In practice, these laws were notoriously difficult to enforce and were violated constantly, particularly by precisely the newly wealthy merchant and gentry classes the legislation was most anxious about, whose growing economic power increasingly outstripped the older aristocracy's ability to maintain exclusive visual dominance through legal fiat alone. The repeated reissuing of sumptuary legislation across successive Tudor reigns is itself, in a sense, the clearest possible evidence of the law's persistent failure. A government does not need to keep reissuing a rule that people are actually obeying. Jewellery completed the picture of walking, glittering wealth display, with pearls in particular carrying enormous cultural cachet. Elizabeth I's strong personal association with pearls in her portraiture, worn in ropes around her neck, sewn directly onto gowns by the hundred, woven into elaborate wigs and headdresses, functioned as both a genuine personal aesthetic preference and a deliberate visual reinforcement of the Virgin Queen's carefully cultivated symbolic association with purity, since pearls carried strong contemporary associations with chastity and the moon goddess Diana, an identification Elizabeth's own propaganda machine actively encouraged throughout her reign. To walk into a Tudor banqueting hall dressed in your very finest was never simply a matter of looking attractive. It was a calculated, expensive, occasionally illegal act of self-presentation, read and decoded by every other person in the room with the same fluent, instinctive attention a modern observer might bring to reading a stranger's car, home address, and job title all at once. Clothing as continuous, wearable propaganda performed anew every single time the wearer stepped into public view. Wine, ale, and the long Tudor night return one more time to the drinking, because underneath the feast, the dance, the gambling table, and the tilt-yard alike ran a single, constant current. The sheer quantity of alcohol the Tudor elite consumed as an ordinary, unremarkable feature of daily life, entertainment included. Ale and beer formed the everyday baseline of drink for virtually everyone in Tudor England, elite and common alike, consumed at every meal by adults and children both, since water quality in this period was frequently, correctly, distrusted, and weak ale served in practice as a safer, calorie-bearing alternative to plain water for ordinary hydration. This much was shared across social classes. What separated the wealthy was access to wine, imported at considerable expense primarily from France, Spain, the Rhineland, and increasingly, as the century progressed, from further afield through England's expanding maritime trade networks. A single feast could consume many gallons of imported wine, priced well beyond the reach of ordinary households, and functioning, exactly like sugar and pepper, as yet another edible marker of wealth and international trade connections. Court drinking customs came with their own elaborate etiquette. Toasting, pledging healths to the monarch or to a host, and the ceremonial passing of communal cups all followed specific, understood social rules, and refusing a toast or failing to reciprocate appropriately could carry real social consequences in a culture that read nearly every gesture as meaningful. Specialized drinking vessels, ornately worked silver and gold cups, Venetian glass imported at enormous expense before English glassmaking matured later in the century, and elaborately decorated standing cups, reserved for the most formal ceremonial toasts, added yet another dimension of material display to the already crowded symbolic landscape of the Tudor feast. Drunkenness among the elite, while regularly condemned by moralists and preachers in exactly the same register used to condemn excessive gambling, was nonetheless a genuine, well-documented, and largely tolerated feature of court entertainment, particularly during the extended, deliberately excessive revelry of the 12 days of Christmas, when ordinary standards of restraint were understood to be temporarily, sanctionedly relaxed across the entire household, mirroring the same controlled social inversion embodied by the Lord of Misrule tradition discussed earlier. Foreign ambassadors visiting the English court occasionally remarked, sometimes with barely concealed disapproval, on the sheer quantity of drinking they witnessed among English nobility compared to continental courts, suggesting that even by the relatively permissive standards of 16th century European elite culture, English court drinking stood out as notably heavy. Spiced and sweetened wines, hippocras, a wine infused with sugar and warming spices like cinnamon and ginger, was a particular favourite, often served at the close of a feast alongside sweetmeats as a kind of ceremonial digestive, represented yet another vector through which the imported luxury spice trade wove itself directly into the physical, bodily experience of elite entertainment, so that the same cinnamon that flavoured the meat course might reappear, transformed, in the wine that closed the evening. Beer and ale production itself was a substantial, largely female-dominated household industry throughout Tudor England, at every social level, with individual households from the humblest cottage to the grandest palace typically brewing their own supply, though the very wealthiest households employed dedicated brewers as specialised staff, producing beer at a scale and consistency that supported the sheer volume of daily consumption a great house required. A single royal or noble household could easily consume many hundreds of gallons of ale and beer across a single week, a figure that becomes less astonishing once it is understood as the everyday beverage of an entire resident staff numbering, in the greatest households, into the hundreds, quite apart from any special feast day consumption layered on top. Beneath the surface conviviality, alcohol also served the same darker, more calculated social function, running through every other entertainment described so far. It lowered inhibitions in an environment where information, gossip, and political intelligence were currencies as valuable as gold, and a shrewd courtier, or a shrewd ambassador gathering intelligence for a foreign government, understood perfectly well that a rival, or a useful source, talked more freely after the fourth cup of wine than after the first. The long Tudor night of drinking, dancing and gaming was never simply relaxation. It was, like everything else in this world, information warfare conducted with a smile and a full cup, where the truly disciplined were the ones who appeared to drink freely while actually watching, calculating, and remembering everything said around them. The royal progress, bankrupting the countryside for a royal smile. Now widen the frame, step outside the palace walls entirely onto a dusty summer road and watch an extraordinary procession approach. Carts, horses, hundreds of attendants, and at its centre, the Queen herself, moving not toward a single fixed palace, but through the countryside itself, turning an entire summer's travel into one long, rolling entertainment. The Royal Progress, an extended seasonal tour during which the monarch and a substantial portion of the court travelled through the provinces, staying as guests at the homes of leading nobility and gentry along the route, served practical administrative purposes, allowing the crown to be seen by subjects outside London, to inspect the loyalty and management of provincial magnates, and to relieve the pressure on any single palace's sanitation and supply systems during the warmer months, when the accumulated waste of a large resident court in one location became a genuine and worsening health hazard. But the progress was, simultaneously and just as importantly, one of the single most extravagant forms of entertainment the Tudor elite produced. Extravagant not for the monarch's own purse, crucially, but for the purses of the hosts unlucky, or ambitious, enough to be selected to receive her. Elizabeth I's progresses in particular have become legendary for the sheer, sometimes ruinous scale of entertainment her hosts felt compelled to provide. A visit could last days or even weeks, during which the host was expected to feed, house, and entertain the Queen, along with an enormous retinue of courtiers, guards, and servants that could number in the hundreds, all while staging an unbroken sequence of feasts, masques, hunts, fireworks displays, and elaborate allegorical pageants specifically devised to flatter the Queen and demonstrate the host's wealth, loyalty, and taste, in that order of importance. The most famous single example remains Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester's reception of Elizabeth at Kenilworth Castle in 1575, an entertainment so elaborate that it survives in unusually rich contemporary documentary detail. Over roughly 19 days, Dudley staged an almost continuous sequence of spectacles, fireworks visible for miles around, elaborate water pageants performed on the castle's lake, featuring costumed figures representing mythological and Arthurian characters, bear baiting, hunting, a specially constructed and lavishly decorated garden built expressly for the occasion, and banqueting on a scale that consumed, according to surviving accounts, staggering quantities of food and drink, even by the demanding standards of Tudor court hospitality. The entertainment is widely understood by historians as, among other things, a spectacular, expensive courtship gesture, since Dudley had long been considered one of Elizabeth's most serious potential marriage candidates, and the Kenilworth entertainments included pointed, repeated allegorical suggestions urging the Queen toward marriage, suggestions Elizabeth, characteristically, absorbed with apparent delight while committing to absolutely nothing, continuing her decades-long political strategy of using the possibility of marriage as leverage without ever actually surrendering the independence that possibility would cost her. The cost of hosting a royal progress could be genuinely, permanently ruinous for a family of merely comfortable, rather than extraordinary wealth. Multiple documented cases exist of gentry and noble families who, having secured the enormous prestige of a royal visit, subsequently spent years or even decades labouring under the resulting debt, having exhausted resources on feasting, new building work specifically undertaken to properly house and impress the Queen. Several great Elizabethan houses, including notably Burghley House and Longleat, owe major elements of their surviving architecture directly to renovations undertaken in anticipation of, or as a direct consequence of, hosting a royal visit, and lavish gifts, since a courtier or noble host was also expected to present the Queen with valuable personal gifts during her stay, an expectation that added yet another substantial layer of expense on top of the accommodation and entertainment costs already incurred. And yet families competed, often desperately, for the dubious honour of hosting these ruinously expensive visits, because the alternative, visible royal disfavour, exclusion from the patronage networks that determined access to lucrative offices, monopolies, and marriages, was, in the calculus of Tudor court politics, considered far more dangerous than temporary, even severe, financial strain. Prestige, in this world, functioned as a currency every bit as real and consequential as gold, convertible, given enough time and careful political management, into offices, favourable marriages, and continued family influence across generations. While a family that had visibly failed to properly honour a royal visitor, or worse, had never been selected to host one at all, risked a slower, quieter, but equally real decline in relevance and access. The royal progress, then, represents perhaps the purest distillation of the entire logic running through every entertainment described in this account. Pleasure and ruin, generosity and extraction, genuine delight and calculated political theatre, all bound together so tightly that Tudor observers themselves rarely bothered trying to separate them. When the Queen's procession finally departed a host's estate, moving on toward its next stop down the summer road, it left behind exhausted servants, depleted larders, and account books groaning under fresh debt, and, if the visit had gone well, a family whose social standing had just been immeasurably, if expensively, confirmed. Secret gardens and stolen hours. Not every Tudor pleasure was staged for an audience. Slip now through a low door in a garden wall, away from the crowded hall, into a space designed for precisely the opposite purpose, to be seen by no one at all. Wealthy Tudor households increasingly invested in private, enclosed gardens, not gardens laid out in intricate geometric patterns of clipped herbs and low hedging, viewed from above from a raised mount or gallery specifically built to display the pattern's full design, alongside orchards, secluded arbours, and ornamental features like fountains and sundials, imported or copied from continental, particularly Italian and French, garden fashion. These gardens served an obvious public function, visible extensions of the same wealth display running through every other entertainment already discussed. A fine garden, like a fine gown, was meant to be admired by visitors and reported on approvingly by anyone hoping to flatter its owner. But the private garden also carried a second, quieter function that garden historians and social historians alike have increasingly emphasized. It offered one of the few genuinely private spaces available to elite men and women in a court and household culture otherwise defined by constant, inescapable observation. Great houses were crowded with servants, attendants, and fellow courtiers at every hour. Bedchambers were frequently shared or attended by servants sleeping nearby, and even the monarch's own most intimate moments were, in practice, witnessed by a rotating cast of body servants whose jobs specifically required their presence at moments a modern observer would consider entirely private. Against this backdrop of near total social visibility, a secluded garden arbour, a walled orchard, or a private pleasure house built at the edge of a formal garden offered something genuinely rare, a space where a conversation, a flirtation, or an assignation might unfold without immediate witnesses. Courtly love conventions, inherited from medieval tradition and elaborated further through the Petrarchan poetic fashion imported from Italy over the course of the 16th century, gave elite Tudor men and women an entire shared vocabulary for conducting exactly this kind of coded romantic pursuit, much of it explicitly set in garden imagery, the walled garden as a symbol of guarded, precious virtue, the plucked flower as a familiar and none too subtle metaphor for seduction and loss of chastity, the maze or knot gardens deliberately confusing pathways as a ready-made metaphor for the deliberately confusing, plausibly deniable nature of courtly flirtation itself, where a lady and gentleman might appear, to any observer, to simply be admiring the planting, while actually conducting a conversation loaded with private meaning, legible only to the two of them. The consequences of miscalculating this delicate game could be severe, and nowhere is that more starkly illustrated than in the fall of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, whose secret meetings with the courtier Thomas Culpeper, arranged with the direct assistance of her lady-in-waiting Jane Boleyn, reportedly took place in exactly this kind of stolen, semi-private space and time. Private staircases, secluded chambers accessed while attendants were deliberately positioned to watch for approach, arrangements that depended entirely on the same architectural and social logic of concealed intimacy that a private garden provided in gentler, less catastrophic circumstances. When these meetings were eventually discovered and reported, the consequences were swift and total. Culpeper was executed, Jane Boleyn was executed, and Catherine Howard herself was beheaded at the Tower of London in February 1542, her fate a brutal, permanent reminder of exactly how high the stakes attached to stolen private moments could climb when the person involved happened to be a queen. Not every secret rendezvous ended in the scaffold, of course. The vast majority of flirtations, affairs, and quietly negotiated romantic understandings conducted in garden arbours and private galleries across Tudor England left no trace in the historical record, precisely because they were successfully concealed, which was, after all, the entire point. But the extreme, well-documented cases that did surface into scandal and tragedy, Catherine Howard's fall chief among them, illuminate by their very visibility just how much ordinary, quiet, private space genuinely mattered to the Tudor elite, and how carefully they cultivated and protected the few architectural and horticultural tools available to them for creating it. There is something worth sitting with in this. A culture that performed nearly every meal, every dance, every hunt, and every prayer as a kind of public theatre, nonetheless carved out, wherever it could, small deliberate pockets of privacy. A walled garden, a private staircase, a secluded window seat. Precisely because even the most relentlessly performed life still required, somewhere, a place where a person could simply be themselves, unobserved, if only for a stolen half hour before the next banquet's trumpets sounded and the performance resumed. Death as spectacle, the scaffold and the crowd. There is one final form of Tudor elite entertainment that must be named plainly, because to omit it would be to falsify the picture entirely. The public execution and the aristocratic appetite for watching it unfold in person from the best available seats. Executions of high-status individuals in Tudor England were staged events, deliberately theatrical in construction, and attended not only by the ordinary crowds who gathered for any public execution, but by nobility, courtiers, and, in the most politically charged cases, foreign ambassadors specifically dispatched to witness and report the event back to their home governments as a matter of genuine diplomatic significance. Tower Hill and Tower Green, the scaffold at Smithfield, and other established execution sites functioned, in the specific case of high-profile aristocratic or royal executions, almost as a form of state theatre, with an audience carefully managed according to the same rigid hierarchy governing every other Tudor social occasion. The closer and more comfortable your vantage point, the higher your status, exactly as with the tournament stands or the banqueting hall's high table. Anne Boleyn's execution on Tower Green in May 1536 offers a particularly well-documented case study in exactly this theatrical staging. The execution was deliberately conducted with unusual ceremony for the period. Henry VIII arranged for a skilled swordsman to be brought specifically from France to perform the beheading with a sword rather than the more common and considerably less reliable axe, a method believed to offer a swifter, more certain death, a choice widely interpreted by contemporaries and by later historians alike as a final, calculated gesture of consideration, or perhaps simply of continued royal control over even the manner of his former wife's death. A restricted but socially significant audience of courtiers, officials, and foreign observers gathered to witness the event, and Anne's final speech from the scaffold, measured, controlled, carefully avoiding any direct accusation against the king, even while she stood minutes from death by his order, was itself a performance, delivered with the same acute awareness of audience and consequence that had characterised her entire public life at court. This pattern repeated across the Tudor century with grim regularity. The executions of Thomas More in 1535, of Catherine Howard and Jane Boleyn in 1542, of the Duke of Somerset in 1552, of Lady Jane Grey in 1554, and of countless other high-status figures caught on the losing side of Tudor politics' constant, brutal churn, all followed broadly similar theatrical conventions. A scaffold speech, expected by convention to accept the sentence's legitimacy and pray for the monarch even while privately, in many documented cases, the condemned maintained their innocence of the specific charges that had brought them there. A final ritual moment of dignity, however performed, before the fatal blow, and a watching audience of the social elite, who understood themselves to be witnessing not merely a punishment, but a genuine high-stakes political event, one whose details, who wept, who maintained composure, what precisely was said, how the crowd reacted, would be reported, discussed, and analysed at court for months afterward, exactly as a masque or tournament might be. The broader cultural context makes this aristocratic appetite for watching execution somewhat more explicable, if no less unsettling to modern sensibilities. Public execution of every kind, across every level of Tudor society, functioned as accepted, normal civic theatre throughout the period, understood by contemporaries as serving genuine moral and social purposes, a visible demonstration of justice enacted, a deterrent lesson delivered to the assembled crowd, and, for religious executions in particular, during the violently unstable Reformation decades, a demonstration of doctrinal triumph over condemned heresy or treason, depending entirely on which confession happened to hold power in any given year. Ordinary executions drew large, socially mixed crowds as a matter of routine, unremarkable civic life. The execution of a queen, a duke, or a chancellor simply escalated the same basic cultural mechanism to its highest possible stakes, drawing the highest possible audience. It is worth returning one final time to the uncomfortable continuity this reveals between the bear pit and the scaffold, between the tournament stand and the execution crowd. The same aristocratic sensibility that could commission an achingly tender devotional portrait, weep genuinely at a well-performed masque's tragic allegory, or compose delicate courtly love poetry, could also gather, with apparently undivided attention and genuine emotional investment, to watch a former friend, rival, or queen die by the sword or the axe, reading the entire event, the composure, the final words, the manner of the fall, as a form of performance to be critically assessed alongside every other spectacle the Tudor court produced. This was not hypocrisy exactly, or at least not hypocrisy as a modern observer might first assume. It was, more precisely, a culture in which death itself had not yet been fully separated from the same performative, symbolically dense logic governing every other aspect of elite life. A culture where even dying, if you were important enough, remained, to the very last moment, a form of theatre. Palaces built for pleasure. Step back now, far enough to see the whole stage at once. Because none of these entertainments existed in a neutral setting, they were built, quite literally, brick by brick and pane by pane, into some of the most ambitious architectural projects 16th century Europe produced. Palaces engineered from their foundations to make pleasure, display, and political theatre physically possible on a scale no earlier generation of English monarchs had commanded. Hampton Court Palace, seized by Henry VIII from Cardinal Wolsey in 1529, after Wolsey's catastrophic fall from favour, itself a reminder that even the men who built palaces for entertainment could find themselves, with terrifying speed, cast out of them, became, under Henry's own subsequent even more ambitious building programme, one of the great physical monuments to Tudor entertainment culture. Its Great Hall, completed in the 1530s, was purpose-built with acoustics, sightlines, and a minstrel's gallery specifically engineered to host exactly the kind of feasting, dancing, and theatrical interlude already described in detail. Its kitchens, as already noted, were scaled to feed hundreds at a sitting. Its tennis courts, tilt yard, and hunting park surrounding the palace grounds gave physical, architectural form to the sporting entertainments the court demanded as a matter of course. Even its plumbing, an unusually sophisticated system of lead pipes bringing fresh water from springs some miles distant, a genuine engineering achievement for the period, existed in part to support the sheer logistical demands of housing and feeding a resident court running into the hundreds or, on the grandest occasions, thousands. None such palace, begun by Henry VIII in 1538, and intended from its conception to outdo every other palace in Europe in sheer decorative extravagance, took its very name from this competitive ambition. None such, meaning there existed no such place to equal it anywhere else. Its exterior was covered in elaborate stucco relief work depicting classical gods, Roman emperors, and allegorical virtues, gilded and painted in a decorative programme so dense and ambitious that visiting foreign observers described it with a kind of stunned admiration rarely extended to English building projects, which had historically lagged somewhat behind the most fashionable continental Renaissance architectural developments. None such was never fully completed within Henry's own lifetime, and it was eventually demolished in the late 17th century by a later owner desperate for cash, its precious materials sold off piecemeal. A palace built at ruinous expense specifically to proclaim eternal, unmatched Tudor magnificence, ultimately dismantled for scrap value within roughly a century and a half of its construction, a fate that reads, in hindsight, as a strangely fitting coda to the entire logic of Tudor extravagant display. Spectacular, expensive, and ultimately impermanent. Whitehall Palace, sprawling and architecturally disorganised compared to the more unified design ambitions of Hampton Court or Nonsuch, nonetheless grew under successive Tudor monarchs into the effective administrative and ceremonial heart of English government, incorporating the dedicated cockpit already mentioned, extensive gardens, a tilt yard for tournaments, and eventually, into the Stuart period, the banqueting house that would become one of the great architectural showcases for masque performance in England, its ceiling eventually adorned with Rubens's monumental painted allegory celebrating the peaceful union of the Stuart crowns. Though that specific ceiling postdates the Tudor period proper, it stands as the direct architectural descendant of exactly the masque culture Tudor monarchs had spent a century developing and refining. Beyond the royal palaces themselves, the great houses of the Tudor nobility increasingly incorporated architectural features specifically designed around entertainment and display. Long galleries, extended interior spaces running the full length of a wing, used for indoor exercise during bad weather, for the display of portrait collections documenting a family's lineage and connections, and for exactly the kind of promenading, conversing, and discreet flirtation the garden also enabled. Great chambers and presence chambers, engineered with careful attention to sight lines and hierarchy, ensuring that a visitor's exact physical position within the room communicated their exact social standing without a word needing to be spoken. and increasingly large expanses of glazed window, itself an enormous luxury expense in an age when glass remained costly to produce, incorporated specifically to display a household's wealth to any passer-by, giving rise to the famous, only half-joking contemporary saying attached to Bess of Hardwicke's spectacular Hardwicke Hall. Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall. A building whose vast windows functioned as pure, unmistakable architectural boasting. These buildings were not neutral backdrops to the entertainments already described throughout this account. They were active participants in them, engineered spaces whose acoustics shaped how music was heard, whose sightlines shaped how hierarchy was read, whose scale shaped how many guests could be simultaneously fed, entertained, and impressed, and whose sheer decorative extravagance functioned as a permanent, year-round extension of the same competitive display logic that governed a single evening's feast or a single afternoon's tournament. To understand Tudor entertainment fully, in other words, requires understanding that the stage itself, every wall, window, and painted ceiling of it, was every bit as calculated, expensive, and meaningful as anything performed upon it. The 12 days, Christmas at court. There was one season that gathered nearly every entertainment already described in this account into a single, concentrated, weeks-long explosion of activity, and it deserves to be seen whole. The Christmas season, running traditionally from Christmas Eve through Twelfth Night on the 6th of January, which functioned at the Tudor court as the single most intense, sustained period of organised pleasure in the entire calendar year. Preparations began well in advance, with court officials responsible for the revels, the formal department of the royal household specifically tasked with organising masques, plays, and festive entertainment, working for months to commission costumes, scenery, and performances for the season ahead. The master of the revels held genuine institutional authority and a genuine budget, and the surviving revels accounts from various points across the Tudor period offer historians some of the richest surviving documentary evidence for exactly how much fabric, gold thread, and skilled labour a single Christmas season's entertainment actually consumed. Each of the 12 days carried its own particular customs and expectations. Feasting intensified dramatically beyond even the already lavish Tudor everyday standard, with specific dishes traditionally associated with the season: a boar's head, elaborately dressed and paraded into the hall with ceremony, and, at some households, an accompanying carol sung specifically for the occasion. Mince pies, in this period actually containing minced meat alongside the dried fruit and spices that would eventually, in later centuries, become the dish's sole remaining ingredients. And plum porridge, a rich, spiced, dried fruit-laden dish considered an essential seasonal speciality. Wassailing, the custom of drinking and offering drink to health and good fortune, accompanied by song and often involving a decorated wassail bowl passed communally among a household or a group moving between households, added its own layer of ritualized communal drinking to the season's general excess. The Lord of Misrule, already introduced in the discussion of court fools, took full extended charge of Christmas entertainments across many great households and at the universities and inns of court throughout this 12-day period, organising games, mock ceremonies, and a more or less continuous sequence of entertainments, including exactly the masques, dancing, and theatrical interludes already described in detail, but concentrated now into a sustained, almost overwhelming seasonal intensity, rather than spread across the calendar year's more ordinary rhythm. Twelfth Night itself, marking the culmination of the season, traditionally featured its own specific celebrations, including the 12th cake, a rich fruit cake baked with a bean or similar token hidden inside, with whoever discovered the token in their portion crowned king or queen of the bean for the remainder of the night's festivities, presiding with mock authority over the evening's games, a custom that gave William Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night, first performed at the very end of the Elizabethan period, its title, drawing directly on the established festive association of the date with precisely this kind of sanctioned social inversion and role reversal already familiar from the Lord of Misrule tradition. Gift-giving at the Tudor court followed its own elaborate, carefully documented protocol, with New Year's Day rather than Christmas Day itself serving as the primary occasion for the formal exchange of gifts between the monarch and courtiers, an exchange recorded with meticulous care in surviving gift rolls that offer historians a remarkably precise, almost forensic snapshot of court hierarchy and favour at a specific moment in time. The value, materials, and craftsmanship of a gift presented to the monarch, and the value of the reciprocal gift the monarch chose to present in return, functioned as a closely watched, publicly legible barometer of exactly where a given courtier currently stood in royal favour, with a disappointing royal gift in return, capable of triggering real anxiety and recalibration of a courtier's sense of their own political standing. Elizabeth I's Christmas seasons in particular became legendary showcases for exactly the fusion of masque, dance, feasting, and elaborate theatrical performance already discussed throughout this account, with the Queen's own household accounts recording substantial annual expenditure on the Revels Office's activities across her long reign, even as she remained, characteristically, a notably careful and calculating steward of royal finances in most other areas of governance. An interesting tension that suggests just how essential this concentrated seasonal spectacle was considered to the ongoing project of royal image-making, worth the expense even to a monarch otherwise famous for her fiscal caution. For 12 days, in other words, the entire elaborate apparatus of Tudor elite entertainment described across this account, the feast, the dance, the masque, the fool's license, the gaming table, even, in households that maintained them, the bear pit, ran simultaneously and continuously. An intensified, compressed rehearsal of an entire year's worth of performed pleasure and calculated political theatre, squeezed into less than 2 weeks, before the court settled back on the morning after Twelfth Night into its more ordinary, if still relentlessly performative, daily rhythm. What the ambassadors saw. Some of the richest surviving evidence for exactly how extraordinary Tudor court entertainment appeared comes not from English sources at all, but from the letters, reports, and diaries of foreign ambassadors and visitors, whose job required them to observe the English court with close professional attention and report their findings back to governments in Venice, Spain, France, and elsewhere across Europe. A body of surviving correspondence that offers historians an invaluable outside perspective on a culture that otherwise tends to describe and celebrate itself in its own carefully managed terms. The Venetian ambassadorial reports in particular, preserved with unusual completeness in the Venetian state archives, thanks to that republic's famously meticulous diplomatic record-keeping, offer some of the most vivid surviving eyewitness descriptions of early Tudor court spectacle. Venetian observers, coming from a republic with its own sophisticated and long-established tradition of civic and religious pageantry, were nonetheless repeatedly struck by the specific scale and intensity of English court entertainment under the young Henry VIII, describing a court seemingly engaged in near continuous celebration, banqueting, and display, and noting with particular attention the young king's own personal athleticism, musical accomplishment, and evident hunger for admiration, observations that align closely with and independently corroborate the broader picture already established from English domestic sources. Spanish ambassadors covering the reign of Mary I and later the deeply strained diplomatic relationship between Spain and Elizabeth I brought their own distinct perspective, often filtered through genuine anxiety about English religious policy and the broader Anglo-Spanish rivalry that would eventually erupt into open war and the attempted Spanish Armada invasion of 1588. These reports occasionally combine genuine admiration for specific instances of English court magnificence with a more critical, sometimes openly disapproving undertone regarding the perceived immodesty or extravagance of English entertainment culture. A useful reminder that Tudor spectacle, however impressive by its own internal standards, was also read and judged according to the different cultural values and diplomatic interests of the observers describing it, and was not universally admired without reservation by every visitor who witnessed it. French observers, given the long, complicated history of Anglo-French rivalry and periodic alliance running throughout the Tudor century, paid particularly close attention to exactly the kind of competitive display epitomized by the field of cloth of gold, and French court fashion and taste exercised a continuous, significant influence on English elite style throughout the period, even as the two nations remained, for much of the century, wary rivals as often as allies. cultural admiration and political suspicion coexisting, in this, as in so much else about Tudor international relations, without any particular sense of contradiction. Perhaps most valuable of all, from a modern historian's perspective, are the detailed household and diplomatic accounts describing Elizabeth I's court specifically, written by visitors across several decades of her long reign, which together provide an unusually rich, longitudinal record of how the aging Queen's court entertainment evolved and, in certain respects, intensified as a form of compensatory image management during the later decades of her reign, when Elizabeth's own advancing age sat in increasingly stark, carefully managed tension with the eternally youthful, mythologized Gloriana image her court culture worked so hard to project and sustain through portraiture, poetry, masque, and the Accession Day tilts already discussed. German visitor Paul Hentzner's well-known account of his travels through England in 1598, describing in detail the Queen's public appearances, her court's music and ceremony, and the general splendour of English elite life he observed, remains one of the most frequently cited outside descriptions of late Elizabethan court culture, precisely because of its careful, curious, evidently genuinely impressed attention to detail. Reading these foreign accounts alongside the English domestic evidence already surveyed throughout this account does something valuable. It confirms that the picture emerging from English court records, household accounts, and courtier correspondence was not simply English self-mythologizing, exaggerated after the fact by a later, more romantically inclined national memory. Outside observers, arriving with their own sophisticated frames of comparative reference from some of the wealthiest and most cultured courts in Europe, genuinely found Tudor entertainment culture, its scale, its expense, its theatrical intensity, and yes, its occasional brutality, remarkable enough to describe at length in reports meant for hard-headed diplomatic and governmental consumption back home, not for casual entertainment. When a Venetian ambassador, whose own home city hosted some of the most spectacular civic pageantry in Renaissance Europe, still found reason to marvel at what he witnessed in London, it is worth taking that marvel seriously as genuine historical evidence rather than dismissing it as diplomatic flattery. And it is worth remembering too that these same observers were watching just as carefully for weakness, debt, and strain beneath the glitter, sending home reports that weighed English magnificence against English vulnerability with exactly the same careful attention. Every entertainment described so far in this account, every feast, every masque, every jousting tournament, every ruinous royal progress, rested, ultimately, on wealth extracted from somewhere. And it is worth pausing, honestly, on exactly where that wealth came from, because the answer complicates any purely admiring account of Tudor splendour. The Crown's own revenue in this period derived from a patchwork of sources, including Crown lands, customs duties on trade, periodic parliamentary taxation granted for specific purposes such as war, and, during Henry VIII's reign specifically, the enormous one-time windfall generated by the dissolution of the monasteries beginning in 1536. The systematic closure and confiscation of England's monastic institutions, justified through the religious politics of the Reformation, but motivated in substantial part by the Crown's urgent need for cash, a process that transferred vast quantities of land and treasure, previously dedicated to religious and charitable purposes, directly into royal hands and, subsequently, into the hands of favoured courtiers who purchased or were granted former monastic property at advantageous terms. A meaningful proportion of the gold thread, the imported silk, and the sugar sculpture displayed at Henry VIII's mid-reign banquets can be traced, through this chain of transactions, back to institutions that had, until very recently, been providing charity, education, and healthcare to some of the poorest people in the kingdom. For the nobility and gentry hosting their own lavish entertainments, wealth derived overwhelmingly from land, rents extracted from tenant farmers whose own standard of living, as already noted at the very start of this account, remained precarious and vulnerable to bad harvests, disease, and the ongoing pressures of the enclosure movement, which converted common agricultural land into private sheep pasture or ornamental parkland, generating higher returns for the landowner while displacing smallholders who had depended on that same land for generations. Contemporary social critics, including notably Thomas More in his 1516 work Utopia, explicitly criticise this dynamic in terms strikingly direct for the period, describing sheep, through the mechanism of enclosure for wool profit, as effectively devouring the very people who had once farmed the land they now grazed upon. A formulation blunt enough that it has been quoted by historians and economists ever since as a uniquely clear-eyed contemporary indictment of exactly the economic process funding so much elite Tudor leisure. Taxation, too, fell unevenly, and the burden of supporting an increasingly expensive crown and its wars, building projects and entertainments landed disproportionately on subjects with far less capacity to absorb it than the wealthy magnates whose own contributions, while substantial in absolute terms, represented a far smaller proportional bite out of their overall resources. Periodic popular uprisings across the Tudor century, including the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, a major rebellion in the north of England provoked in substantial part by the dissolution of the monasteries and broader economic grievances, and Kett's rebellion in 1549, driven significantly by anger over enclosure, offer clear, sometimes violently expressed evidence that ordinary Tudor subjects understood perfectly well exactly whose comfort their own hardship was underwriting, even if they lacked the vocabulary of modern economic critique to describe it in quite those terms. It would be a mistake, though, to reduce this relationship to simple, one-directional exploitation without any element of genuine reciprocal obligation or benefit, because the Tudor social order, however unequal, was not entirely without its own internal logic of mutual, if radically unequal, responsibility. Great households did provide employment, often substantial employment, in an economy with few alternative sources of stable wage labour, to enormous domestic staffs, and hospitality, including surplus food distributed to the poor at the gates of great houses following a feast, functioned as a genuinely expected, if paternalistic and carefully calibrated, obligation attached to elite status throughout the period. Almsgiving, charitable bequests, and the funding of hospitals and almshouses by wealthy individuals, including some of the very courtiers who also spent lavishly on masques and gambling, represent a real, if partial and unevenly distributed, counterweight to the extraction described above. But the fundamental arithmetic, viewed honestly across the full span of the Tudor century, remains stark. The sugar sculptures, the cloth of gold, the imported wine, the elaborate stage machinery of a single night's masque, the ruinous hospitality demanded by a royal progress. All of it was, in the final accounting, paid for by a productive base of English land and labour that saw only the smallest, most indirect fraction of the wealth it generated returned to it in any form, while the visible, spectacular consumption of that wealth by a tiny elite proceeded, evening after evening, entirely unembarrassed by the gap. Understanding Tudor entertainment honestly means holding both halves of this picture simultaneously: the genuine artistic and cultural brilliance the era undeniably produced, and the deeply unequal economic foundation that brilliance was built upon and could never, by its own internal logic, have existed without. What survives? Ruins, rituals, and reflections. The candles have long since burned out. The sugar sculptures dissolved centuries ago. The mask costumes, torn apart by souvenir-hungry guests on the very night of their single performance, exist now only as lines of ink in fading account books. None such palace, built to declare that there existed no such place to equal it, was itself dismantled for scrap within a century and a half of its construction, its stones and gilded stucco scattered into other, humbler buildings whose owners likely never knew exactly what they were repurposing. Almost everything described across this account, the feasts, the dances, the sugar, the gold thread, the bear pits, the fireworks over Kenilworth's lake, is, in the most literal physical sense, gone. And yet walk today through the surviving Great Hall at Hampton Court, beneath its extraordinary hammer-beam ceiling, and something of that original theatrical intention still, unmistakably, works on a visitor. The scale is still designed to overwhelm. The acoustics still carry a voice with unusual clarity across the long stone floor. Tour the palace's vast kitchens, still laid out as they were when spitboys turned meat by hand for hundreds of diners, and the sheer logistical ambition of Tudor hospitality remains legible in brick and stone, 5 centuries on, in a way that no written description alone could quite convey. These buildings survive, in other words, not merely as historical curiosities, but as functioning demonstrations of a specific, deliberate philosophy of power. That authority, to be believed, must be seen, and that being seen requires a stage. That philosophy did not die with the Tudors, it simply changed its costume. Consider how directly the logic traced throughout this account echoes forward into forms of spectacle and status display still entirely recognizable today. The red carpet, with its carefully managed hierarchy of who stands where and who is photographed beside whom, is a direct descendant of the Tudor banqueting hall's rigid seating chart, where proximity to power was never accidental and always legible to everyone watching. The elaborate, sometimes absurdly expensive celebrity wedding, staged for maximum photographic impact and reported breathlessly across international media, borrows unmistakably from the same logic that sent Robert Dudley bankrupting himself over 19 days of fireworks and pageantry at Kenilworth, hoping the spectacle itself might shift the course of a relationship that words alone could not secure. Reality television, with its manufactured rivalries, its performed intimacy, and its audience fluent in reading each contestant's strategic calculation beneath a veneer of spontaneous emotion, would have made perfect, immediate sense to any Tudor courtier who had spent a lifetime learning to read exactly this kind of coded performance at a masque or a gaming table. Even the specific mechanics of modern status display carry startlingly direct Tudor echoes. Sumptuary anxiety, the fear that wealth displayed by the wrong people threatens to make social hierarchy dangerously illegible, resurfaces in every era's version of the same underlying tension, from Renaissance laws restricting who could wear purple silk, to modern brand logos functioning as instantly recognizable, universally legible markers of wealth and taste, in a world that has otherwise abandoned formal, legal sumptuary restriction entirely. The impulse behind Elizabeth I's nearly 2,000 gowns, ensuring she was never photographed, or rather, never seen, in the same outfit twice, finds its direct modern descendant in influencer culture's relentless demand for constant visual novelty, each fresh outfit itself a small, calculated performance of continued relevance and resource. Bloodsport, too, never entirely vanished, so much as it relocated and rebranded. Modern combat sports, wrestling entertainment with its heavily performed rivalries and story arcs, and even the visceral, sometimes uncomfortable appetite audiences retain for true crime media and violent spectator content, all carry some genetic trace of the same crowd psychology that once filled the wooden galleries around a Southwark bear pit, watching, cheering, and occasionally wagering on staged violence as an accepted, ordinary form of entertainment. We have, on the whole, become considerably more squeamish about literal animal cruelty as public spectacle. Bear baiting was formally banned in England in 1835, 3 centuries after Elizabeth I delighted foreign ambassadors with it. But the underlying appetite for witnessed, ritualized conflict has proven remarkably durable, simply finding new forms better suited to changed sensibilities. Perhaps the most poignant continuity, though, lies not in any of these specific parallels, but in something more fundamental, the gap itself, the one this account opened with, between the groaning banqueting table and the hungry cottage outside the walls. That gap has not closed in the intervening 5 centuries, so much as it has changed its geography and its scale, running now not between a single palace and its surrounding villages, but across entire regions and continents, between gated compounds and refugee camps, between a single evening's celebrity spectacle costing more than an ordinary family's lifetime earnings, and the genuinely desperate hardship experienced at that very same moment by people who will never see the inside of the room where that spectacle unfolds. The Tudor elite, for all their genuine cultural brilliance, never resolved this contradiction. They performed straight through it, evening after evening, century after century, apparently untroubled by the dissonance, because the performance itself, the display, the theatre, the sheer unembarrassed confidence of it, was, in the end, precisely the point. What Tudor entertainment ultimately reveals, stripped of its costume and its candlelight, is not so different from what any era's spectacle of wealth reveals, if we are willing to look at it clearly. That the powerful have always needed an audience, that pleasure among the very rich has rarely been simply personal, and that the line between celebration and control, between genuine joy and calculated display, has never been as clean as either the participants or the spectators might prefer to believe. The masque ended, the candles burned down, the sugar sculpture was eaten or discarded, and by morning the hall stood empty, waiting for its next performance. Somewhere beyond the walls, the fields were still being worked, the rents were still coming due, and the gap between the two worlds remained exactly as wide as it had been the night before, patient, permanent, and largely unremarked upon by anyone standing on the well-lit side of it. 500 years later, walking through the same stone halls now filled with tourists rather than courtiers, it is worth asking, honestly, how much distance actually separates that world from our own, and whether the candles we still light for our own spectacles burn any differently than theirs did. Before the closing reflection, one more room deserves a visit, smaller in scale than the banqueting hall, quieter than the tilt yard, but no less revealing of what it meant to be idle, wealthy, and watched in Tudor England. The tennis court. Real tennis, the enclosed, walled ancestor of the modern lawn game played today, was among the most fashionable athletic pursuits of the Tudor elite, and Henry VIII pursued it with the same intensity he brought to hunting and jousting, maintaining dedicated courts at Hampton Court, one of which survives and remains in occasional use today, making it very likely the oldest real tennis court still active anywhere in the world. The king was, by contemporary account, a genuinely skilled and enthusiastic player in his younger years, and matches at court drew spectators and heavy betting in equal measure, the enclosed court's confined dimensions making it, if anything, an even more intimate and intense arena for wagering than the open expanse of a tilt yard or hunting park. There is a persistent, evocative tradition, impossible to verify with total certainty but consistent with the timeline, that Henry VIII was playing tennis at the very moment news arrived of Anne Boleyn's execution in May 1536. Whether literally true or not, the anecdote has survived precisely because it captures something contemporaries and later chroniclers alike found darkly fitting about a king whose leisure and whose lethal exercise of power ran, so often, on remarkably parallel tracks. Archery occupied a rather different cultural position, sitting at the intersection of aristocratic sport and genuine national military policy in a way none of the other entertainments described in this account quite matched. English law throughout the medieval and into the Tudor period actively required able-bodied men to practice archery regularly, a legacy of the longbow's crucial role in earlier English military triumphs. And while this requirement fell most heavily on ordinary subjects rather than the nobility specifically, elite archery butts, contests and prizes remained a genuine popular feature of court and country house entertainment throughout the Tudor century, blending sporting pleasure with an ongoing semi-official anxiety about maintaining the kingdom's traditional military skill base, even as gunpowder weaponry steadily, inexorably displaced the longbow's battlefield relevance. Bowls, played on carefully maintained, expensively levelled greens that only the wealthy could afford to construct and maintain, offered a gentler, more sociable alternative sporting pastime, one particularly associated in the historical imagination with slower, more contemplative afternoon leisure, rather than the athletic display of tennis or the martial symbolism of archery, though it too carried its share of heavy betting and, periodically, its own share of moralist disapproval directed at the gambling that inevitably accompanied it. What unites all three of these sporting pursuits and connects them back to the hunt and the tournament already examined at length is the specifically bodily nature of the display involved. In a court culture obsessed with reading character, breeding, and fitness for rule through nearly every available visual signal, clothing, dancing, gaming behaviour, scaffold composure, the physical body itself, its strength, its grace, its stamina, its skill under the pressure of a watching, wagering crowd, remained one of the most immediate and unmistakable texts available for that reading. A king who could still win at tennis, still outride his younger courtiers in the hunt, still loose an arrow with genuine skill, was making an argument about his fitness to govern with every muscle, an argument no amount of clever rhetoric could fully substitute for, in a political culture that had not yet fully separated the health of the sovereign's literal body from the perceived health of the sovereign state itself. Ladies-in-waiting, the quieter theatre. Nearly every entertainment surveyed in this account has, so far, centred heavily on scenes dominated by male display, the joust, the hunt, the tennis court, the tournament, but it would badly misrepresent Tudor court culture to leave the impression that elite women were merely spectators in this world of performed pleasure. Their theatre simply ran, for the most part, on a quieter, more tightly controlled stage. Ladies-in-waiting, the women who attended the Queen or a great noblewoman in her private and semi-private chambers, occupied positions of genuine social and sometimes political significance, however domestic their daily activities might appear on the surface. Needlework, often dismissed by later observers as a merely decorative pastime, functioned in practice as a serious, skilled art form and a genuine social occasion in its own right, with elaborate embroidery projects, altar cloths, clothing, wall hangings, providing hours of shared, intimate female company, during which conversation, gossip, and genuine political intelligence flowed as freely as it did around any gaming table or garden arbour, simply among a different, more exclusively female audience. Mary, Queen of Scots, during her long years of captivity in England, famously produced extensive, symbolically loaded embroidery work, some of it containing coded political imagery, a reminder that even needlework in this period could carry genuine subversive weight, rather than functioning as merely decorative occupation. Private music making offered another significant avenue for elite female accomplishment and entertainment, with skill on the lute or virginal considered a genuinely desirable, actively cultivated attribute for a well-bred young woman, taught by hired music masters alongside dancing instruction, and performed both for private family entertainment and, for the most skilled practitioners, as a genuine source of personal pleasure and self-expression within the relatively narrow range of publicly sanctioned outlets available to women of the period. Elizabeth I herself was a genuinely accomplished keyboard player, reportedly continuing to play the virginal for her own private pleasure well into old age, and foreign ambassadors occasionally recorded being deliberately permitted to overhear her playing, apparently accidental moments of intimacy that, exactly like her early morning dancing already discussed, were almost certainly allowed to be witnessed and reported precisely because they reinforced a carefully cultivated image of continued personal vitality and cultured refinement. Female literary patronage and, in a smaller number of cases, female authorship itself represented another significant, if more constrained, avenue of cultural participation. Women of the highest rank, including several of Henry VIII's own wives and daughters, commissioned and received dedications of literary and religious works, participated actively in the intellectual and religious debates convulsing the century, and in notable individual cases produced their own writing. Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife, published religious works under her own name during her lifetime, a genuinely unusual achievement for an English woman of the period, while numerous noblewomen produced substantial private correspondence, translation work, and household management records that, taken together, complicate any picture of Tudor elite women as purely passive recipients of the entertainment and cultural production surrounding them. Matchmaking and marriage negotiation, meanwhile, functioned as perhaps the single most consequential ongoing game elite women navigated throughout their lives, one conducted with a strategic sophistication fully equal to anything transacted at a gaming table, even though the stakes, an entire life's social position, financial security, and personal autonomy, negotiated and settled through a process in which the woman herself often had only limited direct voice, were dramatically higher and far less voluntarily assumed than an evening's wager on a hand of cards. The dance floor, the masque, and the garden arbour, already discussed at length throughout this account, functioned, from the perspective of an elite Tudor woman and her family, as genuinely serious venues for exactly this high-stakes evaluation and negotiation, disguised, as so much of Tudor entertainment was, beneath a surface of leisure and pleasure. Elizabeth I's own decades-long refusal to marry, sustained against enormous, continuous pressure from councillors, parliament, and foreign suitors alike, stands as perhaps the single most consequential act of a Tudor woman effectively declining to play a game she was expected, by every convention of her culture, to play through to its expected conclusion. And her ability to sustain that refusal for an entire reign, deploying the mere possibility of marriage as an ongoing diplomatic and political tool, without ever actually surrendering to its terms, represents one of the more remarkable individual performances, sustained across decades rather than a single evening, that this entire account of Tudor entertainment and calculated display has to offer. It was, in its own quiet, patient way, every bit as theatrical and every bit as consequential as anything staged in the Great Hall at Hampton Court. Coda, the last candle. One image before the hall finally goes dark for good in this account. It is very late. The musicians in the gallery have played their last galliard, and their instruments now sit silent, strings still faintly warm from hours of playing. The high table has been cleared, though wine stains still mark the linen, and a servant moves quietly along its length, gathering the last of the silver plate before the rats that live in every Tudor building, however grand, can find it first. Somewhere in a side chamber, a gambler who lost badly tonight is quietly calculating exactly how much of his family's land he will need to mortgage to cover the debt of honour he cannot, under the code that governs his entire social world, refuse to pay. Somewhere else, in a walled garden now lit only by moonlight, two people who should not be alone together are, for a few more stolen minutes, alone together anyway, fully aware of exactly what they are risking and choosing, for now, not to think about it. And in the king's or queen's own private chamber, the monarch whose entire evening has just been spent performing effortless, godlike magnificence in front of several hundred closely watching subjects, is, finally, alone. Or as close to alone as anyone that important in this world is ever permitted to be, with whatever private exhaustion, private grief, or private fear the performance was, in the end, designed to conceal. This is the truest image this account can offer of Tudor entertainment among the filthy rich. Not simply the candlelight and the sugar sculpture and the gold thread, dazzling as those undeniably were, but the sheer, relentless, exhausting labour of the performance itself, sustained night after night, season after season, by people who rarely, if ever, got to set the mask down entirely. They ate astonishingly well while people beyond their walls went hungry. They danced with genuine physical joy while calculating every single step, exactly who was watching, and what that watching might cost or earn them. They wept real tears at a beautifully staged tragedy and, days or years later, sometimes stood dry-eyed and composed while watching a former friend die by the sword for exactly the same reasons that had, not long before, made that friend a rival worth destroying. They built palaces proclaiming their own eternal, unmatched magnificence, and watched, or their descendants watched, those same palaces sold for scrap within a few generations. They were, in other words, entirely human, brilliant, cruel, anxious, funny, vain and generous, often within the very same evening, and the vast, glittering machinery of Tudor entertainment this account has spent so long describing was, in the end, simply the most visible, most expensively documented form that particular human contradiction happened to take. The candles eventually all burned down. Ours will too. What Tudor England leaves behind, in its ruined palaces and its surviving account books and its portraits of faces that have been dead for half a millennium and yet still look back at us with an expression we recognise instantly, is not really a lesson about excess, though it is certainly that. It is a mirror, held up across 5 centuries, reflecting back an uncomfortably familiar truth, that wherever there is enormous wealth pooled next to enormous want, the wealthy will build a stage, light it beautifully, and perform upon it as though the lights might never go out, right up until, one night, quietly, without any particular ceremony at all, they do.